So Peter, he works as a managing director of the Institute of Credible Christianity in California. And you're traveling quite a lot, being part of discussions like this. And here we also have Henrik Sawela, and you come all the way from Toosby, excuse me. And when I asked Henrik, so how should I introduce yourself? And then he said, well, I've been a secular humanist, a skeptic ever since I was a child. And he's also been a board of the Humanist Association and also the Freethinkers in Helsinki. So his passion is secularism. Warm welcome to both of you. A little bit about the structure of this event. We will let both of the speakers first do an introduction, 15 minutes each. After that, they will be able to respond to the others' introduction for 8 minutes, and then again, 3 minutes. And after that, it will be time for you. You will get the opportunity of asking questions. So already now, if you have a question which you bore in mind already from the start, write it down so that you won't forget it when it's your time. That's sort of the structure. And when you ask a question, do it briefly, and also ask whom are you addressing the question. Okay. We let Henrik Sawela start. The topic of today is the problem of pain. Does faith make it better or worse? I would be delighted listening to what you have to say.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction and for asking me to participate in this event. I have had some technical problems which led to actually my printer. So I had to rewrite my whole speech in handwriting, and my handwriting isn't the best. Let's see if I can read it. Where was God when millions of humans were killed in Auschwitz, in the prison camps of Stalin, in Rwanda, or in the tsunami? The classic theory problem has no convincing answer to why God allows for such and numerous other catastrophic events. Why he accepts that these sort of events happen. How can an all-powerful and all-loving God allow such to happen? The Finnish Archbishop at that time, Bishop Eero Huovinen, realized that there just wasn't any good explanation. Maybe somebody of you remembers what he was saying. He had behind him a thorough background in academia and had found no convincing explanation to this sort of catastrophes. As an intelligent, critical human, he found nothing better to say than, quote, maybe God had just fallen asleep, or just not been at the place. We can actually ridicule his answer both as atheists and you as believers. But I must give him some credit for not trying to build a nonsense theological verbal card house explanation. He was well aware of all the tries to explain how all-loving God could let catastrophes happen, and found none of these explanations convincing. You must bear in mind that he wasn't only speaking for himself. His thoughts were probably shared with all the other bishops too. Not only in Finland, but I suppose in all Protestantic churches as well. The historic critical way of studying religious questions is intellectually the highest level you can study theology. But it comes with a cost. You cannot anymore take for through shallow explanations that has tried to explain away the difficulties in finding intellectually satisfying answers to the questions why pain exists. 9 million babies below the age of 5 dies every year. Their suffering and the grief felt by their parents doesn't touch God at all. At least not so much that he would do something to prevent these deaths. Many of these deaths are due to overpopulation and overpopulation is due to lack or unsatisfaction and insufficient birth control. In some cases, people just don't have all the means to get contraception. In many cases, however, the reason not to use contraception is due to the teachings of representatives of various churches. The crappier the life of people are, the more prone they are to cling to any belief system, to religions. And if you just explain the pain and suffering away by promising a paradise after death, well, that's pure crowd control. That's why religions have been such an attractive tool for many governments. That didn't pay too much attention to alleviate the life of its citizens. It's not surprising that churches and earthly powers have walked hand in hand, supporting each other. There have been exceptions, but if you think of the history in Europe, almost always the churches and the state has been best friends. When you think about in what kind of an environment Christianity was founded, you should remember that only 100 generations ago, people sacrificed their children in order to get a good harvest or to protect their buildings. That's why so many of us in the modern world cannot always take seriously beliefs that were found 2,000 years ago. From a naturalistic point of view, there are no absolute moral laws, as assumed by some and not only by some of the Christians. The fact that our moral considerations constantly change and apparently is apparent. Who really think that we are following the rules and norms practiced by Christians 500 years ago or even 150 years ago. The Christian churches have never marched in the forefront when it comes to adjusting moral norms to changing conditions in societies. On the contrary. And as we can easily notice, there is no right and is no one right and by all Christians accepted norm system. The churches are changing their views all the time, but only when the discrepancy between the church norms and the norms of the rest of the society has been too obvious, too difficult to handle. Then the churches silently change their course. Usually only the fear to lose members is the best motivator. This is, however, only a half-truth, as there are always forward-looking liberal priests and theologians. As we know from the Finnish evangelic Lutheran Church, also a small number of conservatives can step on the brake and hamper the needed change in the church. We, the naturalists, non-believers, think that ethically right or correct actions are guided by facts and reasoning, and that they can be taken by people regardless of worldview. This means that the Christian faith doesn't give the Christians any upper hand when it comes to make choices: what is good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. It's difficult to understand that God has created a world where everything is just temporary, provisional. Everything in this world, everything in the universe will be destroyed. Actually, every atom in you is a result of destruction. Stars have exploded, and every atom in your body has its origin in an exploded star. And so the development or destruction of this planet is also quite inevitable. And if you think as God as a good actor, all-powerful, then this destruction must naturally be good in his opinion. And how this goes hand in hand with the idea of a benevolent creator, I do not understand. Also the fact that all animals are just a step in the food chain indicates that the benevolence of the Creator is rather limited. The pain and horror in an animal can feel when ripped apart by hyenas, wild dogs or lions is obviously of no concern for God. From a naturalist perspective, one of the worst consequences of churches is, as a result of their promoting their own religion, they are building barriers between people. And these barriers can easily be used when motivating people to horrifying deeds. They can be the sole reason to conflicts and have been used in various, as an excuse in many conflicts. Not always as a main conflict, but as motivators for the people to participate. Actually, I think this will be enough for the moment.
Thank you, Henrik. Now, please, Payne.
All right, the problem of pain, does it become better or worse with God? A couple of clarifications on the question. We're talking about physical pain, psychological suffering, and death. We're also talking about pain caused by natural causes and by human causes. And when we're talking about God, we're talking about God of the Bible, not just God in some generic sense. But it's better compared to what? So I'm assuming here it's better compared to atheism or naturalism that says that there's nothing but the physical world. So that's the point of comparison. By the way, naturalism is the view that all that's real is physical and everything is ultimately explainable by physics. There are two aspects to the problem. One is the personal experience of pain and suffering. The other is understanding why there is so much pain and suffering. When one looks at the first, there's physical pain, but there's all these aspects of psychological pain. Dreams shattered, sexual abuse, betrayal of trust, ridicule from others, depression, anxiety, loss of physical or mental abilities, loss of a sense of worth or purpose, suffering arising from seeing other people suffer. And when it comes to death, there's the suffering of anticipating death for oneself, and also the grief over death of others. So there's very much a personal psychological side to the problem of suffering. I maintain that belief in God definitely helps with regard to the personal experience of pain, suffering, and death. Belief in God provides comfort and strength in the midst of pain, hope for the possibility of healing even when doctors don't offer hope, hope in the face of death, and motivation to care for others. We're talking about the Christian faith. Suffering also is oftentimes a motivator people turn into God. So when it comes to people in suffering, I think it's pretty clear that people who believe in God find comfort in that, and people who don't believe in God don't have that to turn to. Now, it is true that people who believe in God will oftentimes experience disappointment with God. When suffering and death seem pointless, one can feel that God was not present, should have acted but didn't, perhaps doesn't care, perhaps couldn't help. And out of that, if through the experience one holds on to God, that continued belief can help the person. If, however, in the midst of that struggle, the person loses their belief in God or His goodness, the suffering can be worse than for the one who never believed in God in the first place. But for people who continue to believe in God, psychologically, actually, it is a help. So I think that's the first answer to the question. The second one is, why is there so much pain and suffering? And this is a philosophical, theological question, which basically runs, if God is all-powerful, He could prevent suffering. If God is all good, it seems that He would prevent suffering unless it serves a greater purpose. Much suffering does not seem to serve a greater purpose. So then why does God permit it? That's the problem in a nutshell. Let me say for the atheist, there's a different kind of problem. Obviously, the atheist doesn't have the Christian problem. But for the atheist, there is no God who will help him or her through suffering, nor is there any hope beyond suffering and death. Also, for the atheist, it is difficult to defend the moral claim that people ought to care about everyone's suffering and ought to do what they can to minimize suffering. Now, compassion is naturally appreciated by most people, but lack of compassion is also a natural human trait. Morality for the atheist, it seems to me, has to equate with what individuals or groups collectively value. If they differ in their values, there's no objective way of saying who is right and who is wrong. And it's not the case that compassion towards everyone is valued in every society or by every individual. Coming back to the problem for Christians, the preliminary point is there's two ways an atheist can develop the attack against the Christian faith from the problem of pain. One is to claim to know moral right and wrong, and say the God of the Bible fails. The difficulty there is it's very difficult to establish what is moral right and wrong. So most atheists will not say, okay, I can't criticize Christianity until I have a standard. The problem that you have as a Christian is internal to your set of beliefs. So rather than working from a set of beliefs that they believe are objectively right, their contention is that Christianity involves wholly incompatible beliefs, or at least beliefs that are in extreme tension with one another. I want to point out that if the second approach is used, then it's perfectly appropriate for a Christian to appeal to theology. After all, the claim is that Christians' beliefs are inconsistent with one another, And if by appealing to theology can help answer that question, it's appropriate. It's philosophically appropriate given the nature of the attack that's being made. So I will be doing that. I want to say the important question is not, can one explain all evil and suffering? One can't. The important question is it reasonable to trust God in spite of what one does not understand? So you imagine a scale. You have the problem of evil, suffering that you don't understand. It can still be reasonable to believe in all-good God, all-powerful God, if you have enough evidence on the other side. If the problem of suffering and pain is as huge as most atheists would make it be, then the weight of the evidence on the other side has to be huge. So it is actually worthwhile to have partial explanations which can reduce the size of the problem. Doesn't eliminate the problem. Partial explanations are partial. But nonetheless, if you reduce the size of the problem, thinking about what's reasonable, the case for belief in a good God doesn't have to be as huge as it was otherwise. There are three significant partial explanations. Actually, there's more than this, but three which I think are particularly important that Christians use. One is the idea of free will. Namely, it's good that we have the freedom to obey God or disobey God. It's good that we have the freedom both to do good and to do harm. But of course, if we have that freedom, we can choose not to trust God, and we have the freedom to do harm towards other people. And if God has given us that freedom, I suggest that He's going to actually have us live with the consequence of that. In fact, I'll argue a bit later that it may be that a moral obligation on God's part, or something which God will hold to, is that when He gives us moral responsibility, we actually live with the consequence of what we do, in most cases. A second argument that's given is moral development. Almost all of us grow personally, most in difficult times. When things are going smoothly, we don't develop morally very much. Is this a good world for moral development? Yes, it is. In fact, the ambiguities and the things we don't understand helps to make it a good world for developing moral character. The third point is restoration in relationship with God. If one is a Christian, one believes the most important thing that any of us can ever accomplish is restored relationship with God. That's where we truly discover our humanity. And if one believes that this life is not all there is, then if suffering actually helps us recognize our need for God, it can be a good thing. Even if we suffer a great deal, if it brings us to a recognition of our need to God and trust Him, to be restored back in relationship with God is worth it. However, there are problems that remain. One, there are instances of suffering that these explanations don't cover. Two, there's intensity and duration of suffering that doesn't make sense. Why should it be as intense or as long if these are the objectives that God has? Third is distribution of suffering. For example, some forms of cancer strike people at the same rate regardless of moral or spiritual character. After all, if God is wanting to give you suffering so you'll develop a moral character, why should people high moral character oftentimes suffer as much or more than people who are low in moral character, likewise with spiritual character? However, I think that a poor assumption is made by many atheists and also by many Christians. The poor assumption is that if God allows evil and suffering, it must be because some greater good arises from it. If you buy into this assumption, an implication of it is that the actual amount of suffering is the ideal amount for the best outcome, with the qualification that having free will involve some negative consequences. But apart from that, this assumption says this is the best of all possible worlds, assuming freedom brings some bad things into it. Two problems with this assumption is the amount and distribution of pain does not at all seem ideal. And when an atheist says it doesn't seem ideal, it doesn't seem ideal to me. But for Christians, perhaps an even more important problem is the Bible does not say this is the best of all possible worlds. When I read my Bible, it's quite clear that God is saying that this is a world which is far from what it ought to be. It's a broken and hurting world in need of rescue, need of redemption by God. Now, there are two Christian beliefs that are important. I said theology is going to come in. One is the necessity of the cross. So why is it that Jesus had to die on the cross? What Christians affirm is that God could not simply forgive us. From God on the outside to say, well, people messed up, they screwed things up, They actually deserve separation from me, but I will simply forgive them. The Christian claim is no, Jesus actually had to go to the cross. God couldn't simply say, well, I'm God and I will forgive them. So justice comes into the picture. Interesting when one thinks about the cross. You have justice and mercy coming together. God in his justice could have destroyed all of us. But in his mercy, he's actually found a way in which the death which we deserve was taken on Jesus. So an implication is that God will never do what is unjust. If the cross is in fact necessary, it seems though God can't simply say, well, I'm normally just. But if the consequences get bad enough, I can simply ignore justice. So both justice and love are essential parts of God's character. And one might ask, why does God allow as much evil and suffering? For me as a philosopher, I thought, well, what is justice? How does it enter into it? Because it almost never is almost never talked about. The second Christian belief is the fall of Adam and Eve and its consequences. Now, Christians typically believe that in the garden, Adam and Eve were in direct relationship with God and under his complete protection. They also believe that a just consequence of the fall was death, because it involved separation from God. Actually, God is a pure and holy God, totally opposed to anything which is evil. The Bible describes him as a consuming fire. Whatever is not pure in the presence of a holy God will be destroyed. So it's actually God's grace that his personal relationship was broken with them. However, I would maintain that a just consequence of the fall was suffering. So that when that personal relationship was broken, the protective relationship was also broken. So when they were cast out into the world, away out from the garden, they were put in a world which was dangerous. There would be cancer, there would be tsunamis, there would be suffering. So the first thesis I have is that all of us live in a world where suffering and death are realities, and that this is a just consequence of the broken relationship we have with God. Christians will suffer just like non-Christians will. None of us are exempt from suffering, none of us are exempt from death. So why does cancer affect people the same? It's because we all live in a world that is a dangerous world where cancer is a reality. Thesis B, this does not mean that God never intervenes to prevent or reduce suffering. But what I'm maintaining is when God allows suffering to happen, it's not because greater goods come from it. I'm looking at the problem from a different way. I'm saying when God intervenes, there must be factors which allow God to intervene in the way in which he does. One such factor seems to be faith. God works through faith of people within this world. And by the way, Christians believe that when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, they sided with Satan, and Satan has an influence upon this world. And that affects God's just relationship to this world, I would maintain. Thesis C, when God gave humans significant freedom of the will, it may be that this in general entails living with the consequence of what we do. So an entailment of God giving us moral freedom is God can't simply jump in and make the situation as good as possible. That he can't jump in and help negative consequences be minimized so the outcomes are optimal. So in summary, God cares about human evil and suffering, and does do things to reduce it, often through faith in people in this world. However, this is a fallen and broken world, a world where everyone experiences suffering and death. God will eventually set everything right, but this can only happen at Christ's return. At that time, our present world will end, and God will establish a new and restored world. The Holocaust was referred to at the beginning. The 6 million Jews, plus many other, were killed during World War II. My suggestion is that when God gave us significant moral freedom, we in general live with the consequence of that, even if the consequences are horrific. It's a just entailment of having that responsibility as we live with the consequences. We can do huge things for good, and we can do huge things for evil, and there have been many instances of huge things which are evil which have been done. I'm just about out of time, so I think I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now Henrik has an opportunity to comment for 8 minutes.
fast speaker. My pen is not that fast. First of all, when Peter said that, or indicated that humanists, atheists, in some way, I mean, that we don't believe in a afterlife, but that everything ends by our death, that we have somehow less consolation in this life. I didn't quite understand him. I mean, we are living for this life. We don't expect a life after death. Everything we do is for the good of this life and for others living here among us. We don't plan for anything after our death. Nothing bad can happen to us after that, or to anybody else. The thing with the fallen God, Adam and Eve, who really believed in these as historical facts. To me, it's just another fairy tale. I can't take it at any level seriously. Although some people read it as a metaphor, but still, if you take away from the Bible all the fancy stuff, think that nobody really can take for granted. And one of the things is this fallen world. There is actually not very much left. To think that if two people, to imagine that this story about Adam and Eve, if it would have been true, then to let millions of people suffer just because two people made a mistake, that is not a sign of any sort of morale. How can anybody be responsible for somebody who made took a bite from an apple X thousand or million years ago? I mean, this whole explanation that Peter gives here is a card house of words. Something that you might not have heard any before is that one of our former bishops once wrote in a book that there has never been shown that one God is more probable than any other. That came from the mouth of a bishop. That is rather strange. Interesting. No God has been proven to be more probable than any other. All these arguments in principle that Peter is using for proving his God can be used to prove the existence of any other God. All the God constructions are so eerie, somewhere untouchable, with so vague characters that you can let your fantasy play any game. It's still, again, a house built on cards. It doesn't stand any serious critique. So, was noting that on the academic level of philosophy, nobody looks in the Bible what is right and wrong. Philosophers addressing moral questions never look up in the Bible. They don't care about it. They don't need it. And as I said previously, also the view of the evangelical Lutheran Church is that there is no Christian morale. This is an official version. You can look up in evl.fi. Everybody has the ability to make decisions what is right and wrong, good or bad. And these decisions change over time. As I said, nobody will believe in the same way as your parents or grandparents or generations before that. Also, Peter's view of what is right and wrong has changed from what he thought when he was 50 years of age. There's no reason to think that there is a fixed moral agenda or bunch of moral rules that you can follow. They are always interpreted in some way. But if you accept that, I understand that from a religious viewpoint, you can get out on the slippery slope. It's easier to say they are fixed. Well, that's all for the moment. By the way, we shouldn't say that to start with. You have naturally the possibility to make questions, but we will both be available after this for at least half an hour. So welcome then to make any personal question to me or Peter after this occasion.
Thank you, Henrik. Now, Peter, you may comment for 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I started off by saying that the Christians have no explanation for it. Sounds to me as though his approach he's taking is to say that atheists know what right and wrong is, and that how the Bible fails, and yet he says that everyone has to decide for themselves what is right and wrong. That doesn't seem to be a very adequate answer. If the problem for Christians is an inconsistency in what they believe, then what I did in my first presentation was perfectly legitimate. I gave an account which from a Christian standpoint makes good sense. Now, I don't expect Henrik or atheists to put any stock whatsoever in the significance of the cross that Christians have, nor to believe in the significance of the fall. And by the way, I don't know when Adam and Eve existed. They probably existed a very, very long time ago. But I do believe that they had a relationship with God which was broken, and we suffered the consequences from that. To refer to the Bible as a bunch of fairy tales, actually, I don't know any fairy tales at all. There are some parables, but most of the Bible is narrative, and talking about instructions, so to compare the Bible to a group of fairy tales just doesn't make much sense to me. The church, in fact, has done many things which are wrong. There oftentimes has been a state-church alliance. In fact, from the very beginning, that caused problems. As soon as Augustine, the state aligned itself with the church started burning pagan temples and destroying them, using their power to oppress other people. But if you follow Jesus, Jesus says we are to love even our enemies. And to say that there is nothing which is constant, actually Jesus said that there are two things which are fundamentally very, very constant. One is that we're to love God with all our heart, and we're to love our neighbors ourselves. Does that give any flexibility for context and being able to understand new situations which arise? Yes, it does. Are there some other commands which are applied beyond just simply those two? Yes, there are. But Jesus, all the law and the prophets hang on these two things. So to say that the Christian faith is always changing, I think is true. The Christian times oftentimes do bend to culture, but oftentimes bending in culture in ways which go away from what Jesus actually taught, trying to condone power, condone wealth, and saying you can be wealthy and it's not going to cost you anything at all. He mentioned animal sacrifice, that Christians somehow believe that animals are just part of the food chain for us. No, there's nowhere in the Bible that says animals are just part of the food chain for us. It is true that vegetarianism was not something that was taught in the Bible, but that's to import something from our contemporary context and put it in the old context. Actually, there are indications God does care about animals. On the Sabbath, even your animals were to rest. Your beasts of burden were to have a rest, as well as everyone in your household was to have a rest. There's nothing in Scripture that says we should abuse animals. I think to respect God's creation, which He's given to us, means to respect animals that God has made as well. It says the churches build barriers. The churches sometimes build barriers, but almost always is in kind of conflict with what Jesus taught. For a long period of time, when Jews had to live in a confined part of the city, barriers were built around them. And oftentimes you find religious wars taking place, where people will fight against others because you don't agree with me, whether it's Catholic or Protestant. So yes, in fact, there have been many atrocities done in the name of religion. The important thing to see about this is that both the great things done and also the worst things done are typically motivated by ideology or by religious belief. People will do things that are far worse than they would normally do if they believe God is on their side doing it. At the same time, people will do things which are far greater and good than they would normally do because they believe God is calling us to do it. If you look at humanitarian organizations in the West, almost all of them have Christian roots. Hospitals, orphanages, Salvation Army, caring for the poor. Those are strongly motivated out of Christian motivation. Sometimes with atheists you get the idea that beliefs don't really matter. What really matters are physical drives, sex, food, hunger, etc. But then when you see something like the World Trade Center towers, you'd be, oh, well, look at this, look what terrible things can happen because of beliefs. Actually, beliefs are very, very important. And to think that accepting atheism has no consequences, no, beliefs do have a consequence. If your belief gives you no right and wrong, to say even Jesus' two standards are absolutely right and wrong. We're to love God with all our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. If you don't have those as absolutes, then you're missing something which is crucial and which we need. And actually, as a society, we need to have this as cornerstones for us. And if our beliefs don't give us that as a foundation, if it's simply what societies may value, then there's going to be consequences against that. Last night we were talking and the question was raised about that most people do not do terrible things. Most atheists are not murderers. That's true. The problem when it comes to not believing in God is not that you will do terrible, terrible things. The problem is that when you're tempted to do something which will help you, but be against others, and there's no big terrible thing you're doing, well, why not? Why should I not take more than I deserve if nobody else knows? Why should I pay the taxes I'm supposed to pay if nobody else will know about it? Why shouldn't I cheat on exams if nobody else knows about it? There are lots of small ways in which believing there is no right and wrong will undercut the moral convictions that we have. And small things lead to big things. When people steal from a company and cause the whole company to go bankrupt, it started with small things. Small things lead to big things, and it's important that we have a foundation for the things that we trust. Let me look at see what else I say here. Oh, philosophers never look at the Bible. Philosophers, as I understand philosophy, only appeal to reasons that other people can agree to. So when I appeal to religion, it's because in this context the atheist was challenging my beliefs, or because of something which may help clarify something. But philosophically, I only appeal to reasons that other people can accept and agree with. That's part of the standards of philosophy. And Christian philosophers do very good philosophy in that respect. When it says philosophers never appeal to the Bible, it's true. I mean, good philosophers shouldn't say the Bible says so as a philosophical argument. They may be a personal conviction, but it's something which they only appeal to philosophically if something in the context makes it legitimate. Was the question, why believe one religion rather than another religion? It seems obvious to me there's huge differences between different religions, and if you think there's no difference or they're all equally reasonable, that makes no sense whatsoever to me. If you've ever studied Islam very much, or you study other religions, they're radically different than what Christians teach, and to say they're all equally reasonable does not make sense. Several years ago, there was two books that came out, one by Oxford University Press and one by a press in the U.S. by prominent Christian philosophers who were esteemed within the philosophical community. There are very few Buddhists who I know have that position within the philosophical community. I think it's because the Christian faith is reasonable and there are arguments to be given for it that go beyond what most other religions are able to do. Thank you.
But one interesting thing you missed to comment is on the ex-bishop who told that the probability of any god is not bigger than for any other god. I mean, that was a good and very surprising view of him, but naturally he was not only a Christian there, but a well-educated academic human who realize that they are all on the same line. Peter referred to what Jesus had been, what Jesus said. And most of the words that have, you think that Jesus said, he never said. Most of the words have just been put in his mouth by theologians. The vast majority. And if you really know what Jesus, if he ever was, what kind of person he was historically, he suddenly changed his nature from the rebel to a pussycat who said that give Caesar what Caesar deserves or wants. Strangely, he played the Caesars, the back to the Caesars. And that's why the governments, like churches, Jesus has been enslaved to promote state rule. As I said, churches and states have gone through history hand in hand, although there have naturally been exceptions, but mostly they have been quite still.
Support.
Yeah, supporting each other very strongly. And then Peter said that hospitals has their root in Christianity. Yes, it's true, but unfortunately there were no other players on the field at that time. The states didn't have the structures they have now. There were no other players in that. And to think that the hospitals or universities shouldn't have come or emerged without the help of Christian people is not very well motivated. The brains people had at that time were the same as we have now. They were smart people. They just couldn't find another place to do their studies than, in many cases, the monasteries. Somebody had to pay for their living, and monasteries was a good place to make studies. There were no real alternatives. Okay, that's big. So.
Thank you, and the last time now, 3 minutes to Peter. After that, there will be questions.
To say that every God is as probable as any other is to show a lack of understanding of philosophy. There is no logic of induction that tells you how to weigh evidence. There is logic that tells you when a conclusion necessarily follows. That's called deductive logic. But for inductive logic, there's no formal way of being able to say how strongly evidence supports one position or another position. And hence, when one is talking about two conclusions for which arguments can be given on both sides, there is no objective way of assigning probabilities. And to say they're all have the same probability is to fail to see that probability simply doesn't apply. It cannot apply in that context. And to appeal to someone who says that and thinks he's authority, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. What you have in the case of for the Christian faith versus atheism, you have reasons on both sides. And one has to evaluate those things. He gave the question about the New Testament just being words put into Jesus' mouth. If you actually study it very carefully, most people, there's very, very good reasons for believing that most of what Jesus said actually goes back to that, at least when it comes to the parables and a whole bunch of other things. We know that what was recorded about Jesus was recorded not long afterwards. Even when Luke is writing, and I would argue he was writing in the early 60s when he's writing the Gospel of Luke, he said others have compiled reports, so his was not the first written report. And it was written by a person who had good contact with the original people. To say that it's not, if it's just words put into Jesus' mouth does not make sense. Another example of this is Jesus referred to the kingdom of God, but the early church almost never did. If in fact they're just putting words into Jesus' mouth, they're not words which are their own mouth. So when he asks the question, how reliable are the Gospels? It's a hotly debated issue where you get prominent theologians, scholars on both sides going back and forth. And if you look at that, you'll be impressed by the level of the exchange which takes place there. He said, give to Caesar the things which are Caesar's. Jesus was simply saying, okay, there's some taxes which are owed, but give to Caesar what's his, but not beyond that. To say that Jesus is proposing that they align themselves with Caesar is no way that happened. In fact, the Christian church was persecuted until Rome actually decided they could benefit by being aligned with the church. So the alignment went the opposite way around. Christians in China are persecuted. If Christians are standing by what they believe, that's typically a threat to governments. When they say this is wrong and stand up for that, it's a threat. When they don't, that's not a condemnation of the Christian faith, it's a condemnation of Christians for caving in to secular pressures or wanting influence in government. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now you have the opportunity of asking questions.
I would like to direct my question to Peter. Can we determine what's good without evil? And if that is the case, then why does evil even exist?
Yeah. If you didn't have anything we would call evil, you would call a lesser good evil. I mean, if you get this but get less, that's evil. So evil is always a continuum. Could things be better than they are? Evil is not something which God created, but rather it's when we choose to pursue things which are actually good in themselves, whether it be sex or even power. Power is important for human beings to be able to exercise and control around their environment. When we're powerless, we're being dehumanized. So, let me see, where was I going? Repeat the last part of your question.
Yeah. So if good does.
Do we have to have evil to know that the good is there?
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that if God created a world where we could do better things or not so good things, it would be evil on a different scale. I think when God gave us the capacity to free will, that it gave the capacity for harm. So if it's good that God gave us the capacity, then yes, in fact, evil will come, regardless of whether or not one would like to have it come. Is it good that it's there? It comes because God's given us genuine freedom to do good or to do harm. Is that answer or not?
I'm not sure I follow.
Yeah, well, some people say you have to have a contrast. Well, suppose you didn't have a contrast. Suppose angels never knew about human fall and they just simply, they wouldn't have a contrast. Would they have an idea of good? Well, I think they'd have an idea of good, or at least they'd enjoy those things. They wouldn't have a knowledge of evil like Adam and Eve had after they fell. But I don't think you have to have evil. That doesn't justify, you don't have to have evil in order to have good. You may just not realize that things could be far worse.
I have a question which is mostly to Henrik, but of course I would like to know Peter's view on it also. If we see that our species as humans, we have evolved and we have been the most successful species throughout the history. And we have come to this point basically by dominating other species. And dominating not only other species, but those of our species who are less developed and not as good, intelligent and strong as we are, who sit here now. So, how can we, or to what extent is it okay to let other species suffer, or those who are less intelligent or weaker than us suffer? Because that will progress our race, or especially it will make our genome more excelling. Did you get my question?
Yes, I think so. We naturally ascribe to human rights.
Why?
Let's continue. Before we reach the present stage, or a stage or a few thousand years ago, it was more a question of surviving. The moral questions for people or fuzzy or proto people 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, they couldn't argue in the same way as we do. They had morals at that time, but the whole world picture they had was completely different from ours. We couldn't say that they did wrong if they slaughtered somebody else. They just hadn't the mental tools to think on the same level as we do. And if we go further back, Neanderthals and our present race, if our tweak of the Homo sapiens killed Neanderthals by purposely, I couldn't really say that it was wrong to do. They maybe didn't have any alternative. They were not in the same way arguing and thinking like we are today. It was more a question of keeping oneself alive at that stage. If that would happen now, we had Neanderthals here beside us. Naturally, we wouldn't have the right to kill them, because we understand the moral implication of that. That's actually one of the questions why we don't walk around and kill gorillas and chimps, because they are so close to us. We feel a bit like them. We feel that we are sort of a big family, and that's why we describe them some rights too. Was it in any way aligned?
Yeah, to some extent. I have, of course, several of the questions, but I think there are many more of us. But I would like to pull it to other animals. Is it only the intelligence level of the animal that is the motivation why it's not allowed to feel suffering? Or which animals are allowed to feel suffering due to our existence as humans here on the planet, and which species are not?
Well, let me just respond a little before we go to the animal suffering question. It seems to me that human character has not changed enormously over the last 3,000 years. When Jesus, a consequence of Jesus' teaching, that came out in towards the end of the first century, there was a Roman who was remarking, why is it these Christians, not only do they not throw out unwanted babies simply to die, but they will take in other people's babies, right? Well, if you think this sort of this modern moral idea was not around back then, it was very much around, was very much part of Jesus' teaching, and I think that was part of why the Christian faith grew as quickly as it did. Or even in the Old Testament, you had the Jews being told, be kind towards strangers and aliens, because remember how badly treated you were when you were in Egypt. You need to treat strangers in ways contrary to that. So this moral ideas were there. It is true that people talk oftentimes about us and them. In fact, Jews oftentimes view themselves as being special and other people are not worth anything. But that's not something which is taught in the Old Testament. In fact, Israel was to be a blessing to the nations. In terms of just the natural inclinations we all have some moral sense. There's been study done on 2-year-olds, even before they can talk, within which they recognize kindness and appreciate it. That's not some new development. That's something which has been around for a long time. When it comes to the idea that you need to be kind to people who are not closely related to you, Jesus brought in a revolution with that. And contemporary ethics today is actually very, very much indebted to the teaching of Jesus, whether or not they recognize it. We'll turn to animal suffering, so why don't you say something about that?
If we start with human rights, there are no universal human rights, coming from somewhere else. We are giving ourselves or other in our own species rights. We have decided that humans has to be given rights because that is good for our survival. If we don't treat each other with respect, no society will survive, and everybody actually will at the end lose if we don't ascribe to certain rules. And the same thing with animals. Animals don't have rights as in themselves. We can give them rights. We can think that we treat them better than other animals. It's just a question. I mean, if you take a fish, you wouldn't give a fish the same rights as you give chimpanzees, chimps, for example. There is no objective, you can say, reason why this is right to give the chimp more rights than the fish. It's just something we sympathize more with the chimps than with the fish. It's also possible that the chimp feels more pain than the fish feels. It's on a more primitive level. But it's a continuum. We can never say that for this or that reason we give that animal more rights. It's not a universal right. It's just up to us. Each of us give different rights to different kind of animals. A cat and a lover give more rights to cats than to dogs.
So you're okay with me strangling and torturing a chimpanzee, but then having a fish in my
No, I can feel compassion for the fish also. I don't torture fishes.
Yeah, but
no chimps.
You're okay for me doing so because I used to do so.
No.
Why can't you be okay with that?
No, we have a law against being cruel to animals.
Yeah, in Finland, if we say I'm in a country where we don't have, if I establish my own country and I do not join, let's say, this is philosophical motivated. I understand that philosophers often they ask what if question, what if we have this thing, to clarify their stance, their moral stance. So if I have a country and I establish a country with me and Robin here, and we do not join the...
No, he don't want to establish that.
I thought the question here, part of your argument was if we don't give these rights, it will undercut our own survival. When it comes to animal rights, I believe that we should treat animals with dignity. If you eat beef, you ought to slit the animal's throat so they don't feel pain. They're going to die anyway, but you have to do it in a humane way. But to say if people did not do it in that way, it doesn't seem as though the human race would not survive. I'm not sure where survival comes in.
No, that was more a reference to how we treat ourselves.
Okay,
each other as humans.
Even there, human beings have been killing other human beings from as far back as we can remember. And with overpopulation being a problem, it actually has not impeded our survival. Maybe it's actually helped because there are fewer people living. I don't agree with that myself. But I'm asking if your argument is a survival argument for why we should treat everyone with dignity.
Well, if we go back to dictatorships, for example, how do they treat their citizens? Not very well. I mean, the citizens are losing if we are not sticking to human rights. At least as far as I can see it.
Yeah, but the point was how we treat different animals. If I establish a country and then I do not subject to UN human rights standards, so we do not join UN, who says that we can't handle chimpanzees whatever we want because they are not our species? And then we can adore fishes, for example. Is it up to us, or do anyone else have a moral obligation to?
Well, I would think that in whatever country you are, you should have some moral obligation toward not treating, or understand not to treat any animals cruelly.
Okay, but
it's not a question of borders.
Okay.
Okay, the first question is to Henrik. You were talking a lot about human rights and so on, but when you talk about human rights, it's connected with the value of the human being. So my question to you is, what is your value?
What is my value?
As a human being? Because if your value is 0, then you can't have any rights.
Well, if you think our value is 0, then we shouldn't actually have
I
rights.
didn't say
But
that.
no.
I asked you to define your value.
No, why do you think I think that no human have no value?
I didn't say that. I just asked you to define the value of a human being or your value. What is your value?
Well, we have natural inclinations to take care of ourselves and our kins. It's a survival strategy. If you do not, then the human race wouldn't have risen to this level. All social animals in some way value their kins, take care of each other, play according to some rules. Naturally, the animals don't have written rules, they don't have spoken rules. It's in their genes. It's automatic.
Let me say that we now know that primates actually sometimes do kill each other.
Sometimes,
Yes, and so to say, well, it's just animals do it right. They don't never kill each other. Sometimes they do. So it's what makes human beings? It's all right for them to kill each other, or is it not all right for them to kill each other? What creates the objective standard that when primates kill each other, that's wrong?
Well, if we wouldn't understand not to kill each other, then we wouldn't be sitting here. There would never have been a race like human beings.
So if the chimpanzees don't understand that killing each other is wrong, then it's okay they kill each other. Is that what you're saying?
They don't kill each other more than very rarely.
Very rarely.
It's embedded in their genes not to kill their kins.
Well, it's generally embedded in human genes that we don't kill each other, but there's a small percentage that do. I don't know, there's been studies that say there's a lower percentage of chimpanzees that kill each other than humans. It's just that this is a part of our genetic makeup. And part of the question is our value. If it's just the value people give to me, unfortunately in the past people didn't give value to people that weren't closely related to them, so they were just out in the cold. Is that, I mean, if the value is what people give to me, rather than what I think my value is worth, then we're in trouble. There has to be some value that you think you have, which you deserve.
Well, I don't quite get it, but I mean, I don't find any trouble motivating myself not to kill you.
No, but the question came from when you talked about overpopulation.
Yes.
So I can imagine that you think that there are too many people living right now, or at least that it wouldn't expand from too heavily, let's say.
Yes. I think we're all the same opinion.
Not necessary. So that also gives the importance of this question about what your value is. So you don't value many humans, let's say 10 billion, 100 billion humans, or so then the question is, what do you value a single person? What's the value of a single person? So is the value of a single person divided by the amount of every person living? And so on. Okay, you don't have to answer that. I have a second question to Peter. You were talking a lot about the Bible, and you derived the morality from the Bible and so on. So this question is about interpretation. I don't know if I said that right. Judging and so on. So there's a big problem about how you interpret what is written. So I would say that you could came to the same moral conclusion that Henrik has based on what is written. So there's a huge spectrum inside of the morality of atheists, but the same also is about the word of Christianity. You can come up with you can come to a lot of conclusions based on what it says in the Bible and so on. So I don't know how to define this question better than that.
Yeah, and for me as a Christian, the most important question to me is, can I understand what Jesus valued, or is it just my interpretation of it? And it seems to me that if you say what's there represents Jesus, then you actually can say quite a bit about Jesus' values. In fact, many people who aren't Christians at all say they like Jesus' values, but that wouldn't make sense if they have no way of knowing it, and it's just they're interpreting it in a particular way. I think when it comes to what Jesus taught, it's quite easy to interpret Jesus' values, and that's part of why people have such a high esteem for Jesus today. Or with St. Paul, any scholar who knows the writings of St. Paul quite well can say, here's what St. Paul's theology is. There will be points where they'll disagree, but I think it's not the case that the Bible is just open to anyone's interpretation.
But the fact is that there's still the same big space of a spectrum inside of Christianity as there is in atheism, I would say.
Yeah, there are Christians who go out killing other people who aren't Christians. So, I mean, they call themselves Christians. And I find that appalling. But at the same time, one needs to criticize the Christian faith in terms of the people who actually believe what Jesus actually taught. And if they follow that, then they will not go out and abuse other people or treat people poorly or treat people who are not part of them poorly. So it seems to me that if you have a very clear instruction from Jesus is what to do, and that is a clear foundation for us, and other people can look at what Jesus says and say, okay, Jesus is clear about these things as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on to some other questions.
May I quite briefly comment on that, why I don't value people if they are, or what happens when they are 10 billions or 100 billions. The simple answer is that if there are 10 or 15 or 20 billions, everybody will suffer. This planet cannot handle it, and people will suffer really hard. So it cannot be good to raise the population just to get more heads on this planet.
So the value of a human life is how much they can enter.
You cannot. Good question, but it's impossible to answer what is the value of a human. That is a philosophical question. You cannot quantify it.
But I would say the value of the human life is based on the reason we live here, the meaning of us living. But that's also a philosophical question or answer, let's say. But your value to a human life is based on what you just said. I would derive from that the value of a human life is according to how much enjoyment there is in the life of that human.
The amount of enjoyment is the value the human itself feels. And every human should have the right to try to get happy, feel enjoyment, to feel joy, to fulfill the human's capacity as much as possible without stepping on other people's toes. It's not nothing bad to try to get a better life or to be happy. You never have to feel sorrow or bad consciousness if you strive for a better life. You have the right to it.
So if I understood you do believe in human intrinsic value. Every human is valuable, but because everybody will be suffering if we were 10 billions, that's why we don't want it.
Exactly.
Yes, that's it. Let's move on to another question.
And before we take that question, I'd just like to remind you, you can ask in Finnish or Swedish. We will translate if that's easier.
My question is to Peter. I would put to you that me doing something good because I want to decrease the suffering in the world or avoid suffering in the world is better than me doing something good because I fear for my own soul. Would you agree?
Yeah, in fact, I think if the only reason why a person says they trust God is fearing for their own soul, they're probably not really trusting God and their soul is in danger.
Okay, but I think earlier you spoke something in the terms of I'm not sure, I'm paraphrasing you, and please tell me if I understood you wrong, but that basically there's a lacking of morale amongst other than Christians. But there's like you can be an atheist and still want to do something good just on the account of decreasing suffering.
Right, so there's motivation that both atheists have in being kind and nice to people. Basically, you have better friendships, you're happier if you're not extremely self-centered. So when it comes to that basic level of treating other people nicely, atheists and Christians are on the same level. The question becomes, what makes me do something which isn't in my own interest? When in fact I want something strongly and it's not killing another person, why is it that I should look out for someone else's interest? Why should I love my neighbor as myself? I mean, that is really a radical statement on the part of Jesus. And Christians, I think if they're honest, they don't live up to that very well. But nonetheless, they recognize that is the standard that we're called to, what right and wrong is, because every single person is the same value as you. So therefore, you should treat them as you would want them to treat you. And the motivation for that isn't just simply life after death. People oftentimes say, well, Christians are motivated because if they do good things, they will have life after death. Actually, Christians should be motivated out of love for God. That's the first commandment. And in fact, as a person is motivated out of love for God, out of that love for God flows a love for other people. So the motivation is like a parent who does something, obeying a child obeys the parent because the child just loves receiving love from the parent. Now that in one sense is self-centered, but it seems to me that's the exact kind of a relationship which we ought to have with God. And that's what ought to motivate us. If the child's motivation is fear, it's not going to work very well in the long run, and fear is a very poor long-term motivator. That's true for Christians as well. If their motivation is to avoid hell, they're probably not going to follow God very well from that, because other things will detract them. Whereas if they're motivated to love God and love other people, then they will keep in that direction.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I agree with you that I could do something nice, just as Jesus said, or Jesus supposedly said, because I want other people to treat me the way that I treat them. But I don't need to be a Christian to have that opinion. So I don't see a difference. Why?
Yeah, Jesus actually said, if you do something for someone else because you get something back, don't expect a reward from God. You've already got a reward. But if in fact you want praise and reward from God, then you need to treat people well who won't treat you well back. And that goes very contrary to most of us human beings. So to not be treated well, and for someone not to treat me well when I treat them that well, I get upset about that, But in fact, God calls us to a higher standard, which is part of the difference between just a self-interested morality, where I do things because I want things back, and a morality which actually says I need to treat people with dignity, even if they don't treat me back well. Don't treat me well.
And I agree with you. I just feel that amongst a lot of Christians, there's a sense of that you have the copyright to this thinking, but I think it's in a lot of ways a very human way of thinking about how you should treat other people.
Yeah, it's the idea that you should treat other people as being equal value with yourself is not unique to Jesus. In fact, you find, if you go look on Golden Rule online, you'll find quotes from Buddhists and Hindus and various people who basically affirm the Golden Rule. What you don't find is in non-Christian cultures the idea that there's a moral obligation to treat everybody as if they were equal. Maybe there is a culture that's not influenced by Judaism and Christianity that in fact has that as a value, even though there are individuals who do it. It seems to me that the fact that we think in the West that everyone is of great and roughly equal worth, that comes from our Christian background. It's not something which is true elsewhere, even though individuals can come upon that and find it attractive.
I wouldn't agree with you about that, because there have been a lot of societies that have been atheistic. That has there's been a strong thought when founding these societies that everybody's equal. Eventually, a lot of them, I'm thinking maybe about communist societies.
They're from a Christian background. I'm asking for societies that don't come from a Christian background. Is there any society, there might be, because after all, people can come to this idea, but is there any society that actually views everyone as being great worth and roughly equal worth because they're human beings? There can be slight differences in terms of what a person can contribute, but this idea that everyone ought to be treated with dignity seems to me something which is quite rare across cultures, and it may be there are other cultures besides those influenced by the Christian faith that come to that, but I don't know of any.
And then again, you could argue that in a lot of societies, we don't treat people equally. For example, people argue that, it's the question of homosexuality, for example, and there are a lot of people that aren't being treated equally even in these societies that have sprung out of Christianity.
Yeah, and I think homosexuals need to be treated with dignity, regardless of whether or not you agree with their lifestyle. They need to be treated with dignity and be loved like anyone else and be treated like other people.
Yes, but what I'm trying to put to you is that not even in Christian societies or societies that have sprung out of Christianity, we treat everybody equally.
That's true, but if you're following Jesus, a person asks, well, why do Christians hate homosexuals? And I said, if you're really following Jesus, you can't hate homosexuals. That's contrary to Jesus. So yes, in fact, Christians fail lots of times when it comes to how women are treated. There's a long history in the Christian sort of history where women were treated very poorly. And I think that's not following Jesus' own example, where he would sit down and actually carry on theological conversation with women. You read through the Gospel of Luke, and his relationships with women were quite revolutionary. And I think the church is finally sort of catching up to realizing that women need to be treated with the same dignity that men are.
I'm just trying to you said that societies that come out of Christianity, in these societies you will find that people value human lives equally. And I say not even in Christian societies.
I agree with that. There's no society, in fact I don't know any Christian who actually loves his neighbor as much as he or she loves himself, right? But nonetheless, that's the standard God has called us to, and the Christians are drawn towards that. But yes, we'll all fail in respect to that.
Thank you for the question. And
May I give a short comment? It's a humorous one. When Peter said that Jesus talked nicely about the women, what about the apostles? I think that was a very male panel.
Now, Apostle Paul actually had close associates who he called co-workers who were women, which was radical at that time.
But Jesus, all the apostles were men, not the one single woman.
Yeah, I think part of that is that Jesus was signaling to the Jewish community he is reestablishing Israel, 12, on a different basis. And to make that statement clear without having it confusing for Jews would be to have 12 men, be it if you had a woman involved in it, well, that wouldn't be nearly as clear. With a Jewish mindset, which was very patriarchal, for Jesus to do that would be signaling the direction that he's going, that is establishing a new Israel. To say that Jesus should have had women on the group is to try to import something that makes sense back then, but really was not something which would have been culturally fitting at that time.
Thank you. Let's move on to the topic, the problem of pain. Does faith make it better or worse? Does anybody have a question relating to this?
Hello, yes. I had a question for Henrik. You started saying that where was God when all these terrible things happened? And I'm sorry. Jag heter svenska. Så går det bättre. Ja, så börjar med att han var då katastrofen fanns. Ja, och då tänkte jag kanske han fanns hos dem som inte hade de som har tappat någon kanske katastrofen, kanske han fanns där hos dem och tröstade dem. Då tänkte jag, kan inte världen kanske få bli bättre om de här människorna, i alla fall någon av dem, kan få en sorts tröst av att ha en tro på någon Gud.
So the question goes, where was God when all these horrific things happened in the Holocaust and all the horrific things which has happened? Where was God? And he says, what if God was among those suffering? Perhaps faith was among those and giving them hope. Did I get it all? Okay.
Yeah, I would say God was there.
I have a question for Henrik.
Henrik, sorry.
No, I don't.
Go ahead.
Well, how many millions were they that were killed? And the weight of that towards that somebody gets some consolation. I think we had a picture of a scale here. I think that there was no balance there. How can you weigh these both things? Holocaust, Stalin, all the others, 20, 30, 40 million deaths. Somebody get consolation from God, from their belief in God. I can't see anything but a pretty big imbalance.
I did give a response to it.
Yeah, but still, I can see, from a naturalistic point, it's no sense in this. To try to lift up this, that somebody gets a bit of consolation.
My suggestion was that when God gave us significant moral freedom, the part of the justice in giving that to us means that he will not jump in and reduce the consequences if they start getting bad and minimize them or optimize them. So I'm suggesting part of justice in God's character means that he's not going to jump in and stop someone from doing something which is really horrific, even it's like what Adolf Hitler did. If parents are bad parents, God's not going to jump in and stop them from doing things which are very damaging to their children, although he calls us to, in fact, step in and try to do those things. God is the one who has given us moral freedom, and I think that affects his relationship to us.
But if you have a moral freedom, how does it affect those who are killed there?
I think you're abusing the freedom that you have, but nonetheless, God has given us the freedom to both do great good and great harm. And God is not going to be the one who's going to step in and try to adjust it. So, well, that's too much harm, I'll only let it go so far. Or that's so much good, but other people really don't deserve something good, so I'll curb it in some. It seems to me that when God gives us significant moral freedom, at least this makes philosophical sense to me, that a consequence of that may be that God, in his justly giving that to us, is that we, in general, need to live with the consequence of what we do, even if it's horrific.
Thank you. Do we have a question here?
Maybe ask the question again. You didn't answer the question.
Yeah, the original question was directed at Henrik. The original question, again, was... Can we repeat again? You said it before. Yeah.
If there are two possible worlds where it happened, we can take the Hitler killing other people in a world where there was no God, so nobody had comfort from a God, and then a world where he killed as many people, but even one single human got some sort of comfort from a isn't that a better case? That he had to believe in a God and he got conquered?
Well, I think from God's perspective, God grieves deeply that all those innocent people were killed. So again, I'm not sure of the question. I suggest why does God doesn't intervene and prevent it from happening. But I think God does grieve deeply about it, and God will eventually enter in and eliminate all evil completely.
From a secular point of view, there is no sense in what Peter says, but I agree that's certainly his true belief.
If I understand you correctly, you're trying to say that the problem of pain, we have it on earth, but the problem of pain is better endurable if we do have faith.
Yes.
Was that your point?
Yes.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any question?
There we go, please.
I have two questions, one for Peter and you, Henrik, as well. I'll start with you, Henrik. If we say that the purpose of life is for us to find as much pleasure as possible as human beings, then my question would be, why are we never satisfied? Or is it possible to get enough pleasure and be really satisfied?
Well, to get as much pleasure as possible is to put I mean, nobody tries to absolutely maximize only to do things that please us ourselves. It's always a question of balance. I mean, you have to also to do your job, not only eat chocolate.
And then there's also one more question related to that. Would you agree that we all have an innate need for some kind of affirmation from outside of ourselves?
Confirmation.
Affirmation.
Affirmation.
Yes, from outside of us.
I'm not sure that I understand what that means to have affirmation from other. Do you mean from other humans?
Att bli bejakad.
Bejakad? Yes, from other humans, naturally. But not from any force or person outside the human race. I mean, not from above. I mean, this is not human. We are not the human. What do you call it? Homo although many people say that we cannot really live a good life without religion. There are millions, or actually hundreds of millions in the world without any sort of religion. Here in Finland, we are about more than 1.5 million who don't have any religion. And we don't stick out. There are not more of us in the jails or in front of the court. We don't need any moral derived from Jesus or God. We do our own moral.
Okay, thank you. Peter, I was going to ask, for many non-believers, the doctrine of eternal punishment is a tough one to deal with. Is it something you can delve into? Do we know why?
Well, people oftentimes assume that people go to hell for not believing the right things, right? But I don't think that's true. Jesus basically was teaching you need to be connected with me in a right relationship with me. And it's being connected with Jesus, the only one who is holy, that we can share in Christ's holiness and be brought back in a relationship with God. And for people who don't have that, I mean, I think that it's not absolutely essential for a person to even know about Jesus. They may be responding to what Paul says, the law written on their heart. I think most people who respond to God actually are very strongly influenced by hearing the gospel. So Paul talks about how should they call upon God unless someone preach. So Paul himself doesn't think that people will call upon God unless they preach. And yet in Romans 2, he says on the day of judgment, those who have the law written on their hearts will either accuse or excuse. So it seems as though it is possible for a person to respond to the law written on their heart, what they recognize, and actually come before God and be restored in relation with God. but it's because they actually are being restored in relationship to Jesus that they're brought in relation with God. If that union has never taken place, then it's not as though God is choosing to send people to hell. People are separated from God because they have never chosen to align themselves with Him. And whether that's consciously by hearing the gospel or through the law written on their heart, I think we have to leave that question to God. But it's quite clear to me that people are helped enormously by actually hearing about Jesus and what He's done.
Yeah, so this question is for Henrik, and just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, I would need to just make one kind of pre-question here to check out one thing. Would you agree that either there is an objective moral law, or then the other option would be that it's completely subjective, that every person has the right to say what they think is right? Or would you claim that there is a middle ground?
Well, I can here actually be of the same view that the Christian churches, that there is no Christian moral.
No, I didn't ask.
No, there is no objective moral, but there are Christians who claim that there is an objective moral. They are not in line with our church here in Finland, or the Protestant church.
Okay, but that's not what I was asking. Would you say that there is
No, I do not say that there is objective moral. The moral codes that we are following are more or less agreed upon among humans, in some way codified in the normal law.
Okay, so subjective to this
limited is our ability to choose what is wrong and right is it's not completely free. We have outer borders what we can do and not do.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I don't get that. If there is no objective law, then each person's opinion matters just as much. But okay, if we go to my actual question then, you said that Neanderthalers, or what they are called in English, they didn't have the mental tools to discuss things like we have now. When would you say this developed for humans? 1,000 years ago, or?
The human species as we know it now is at least 200,000 years ago.
Yeah, but the capability to discuss and solve things, when would you say that?
I wouldn't say anything, I'm not a biologist, but I would say at least 10,000 years ago humans gathered in cities or bigger dwellings. The human brain was the same 10,000 years ago as it is today.
Yeah.
Most certainly 20,000 years, 30,000 years. But where the line goes, I cannot give you any answer.
All right. So then my question here, that I don't understand your logic in this one, because if there is no objective truth, or truth or moral, okay, moral, let's say that. How can you say that there's anything wrong with Auschwitz?
Well, I tried to explain it previously. Not to kill our kins there are good reasons for that. If we do not follow the embedded rule that is embedded already in our genes, the whole society wouldn't be here.
Okay, so there is an objective.
No, there are certain how we interpret smaller questions is up to. I mean, do I take that or that way? We have our free choice to make in many cases. But the big questions: do we have a right to kill each other? That is pretty clear. Okay. Is it okay to lie? Yes, sometimes. I mean, if your wife asks you, is her dress fine? There's only one good question, whatever you think about it.
Okay. Well, so in some questions there is objective moral.
Or there are more heavy stuff and easy questions.
I just want to say that if you say what comes with human nature, compassion comes with human nature, and bigotry comes with human nature. And you answer, which is right? Saying it's human nature doesn't answer it. Even if you say, well, 99% of parents by human nature love their children. Does that mean the 1% who don't are wrong? Is it a 99%? Is it simply majority? We're a mixed bag. And say, well, people have a right. I'm not sure how appealing, looking at human nature, you get an answer to that unless you somehow say that we're going to define right in terms of compassion. But that's not typically what people mean. They say, actually, you ought to be treated this way rather than just defining ought in a particular moral way. That's giving it content by definition. But we need more than that.
Thank you. We still have 7 minutes left, so please feel free to ask a question.
I will direct my question to Peter again. If you look at the Holocaust or any of the world wars, you have people to blame that they caused it, right? But if you look at natural disasters, take for example the tsunami in 2004, can you really blame people for that? Or
yeah, my explanation about being cut off from God's protection is not only you're protected from harm from other people, you're no longer protected from that harm, but you're living in a world which is intrinsically dangerous. So with the removal of God's protection, once a tsunami comes, people die. It doesn't matter whether they're Muslim or Christian or atheist. But we all live in a world where that suffering is a reality. And my contention is that from a Christian perspective, that's because of the break in relationship between ourselves and God. Now, an atheist may not buy that, but to say there's no explanation from a Christian standpoint, yes, there is. And it seems to me the only way you can then criticize Christians is to say they have objective content. And this is part of what we've been talking about in terms of, well, there is the objective content that says every person ought to be treated with great dignity as being of roughly equal worth. And I just don't see that in human nature.
Okay, so any suffering caused from natural disasters that can, in the end, also be blamed on people, or when sin came into the world?
I think it's living in a world where those things can happen. Now, one can ask the question, were there disease, were there tsunamis, were animals killed in tsunamis before? Yes, there were, although I don't think in the few minutes I can have, I can get into the question of animal suffering. But if you want to talk to me about that, I'd be glad to talk about that. I'm an old Earth person myself, not a young Earth person. So I think there was animal death prior to Adam and Eve, and there was also pain that animals experienced prior to that. But we can talk about that in person if you like.
That sounds like an interesting thing to hear you explain. I'm hogging the mic for a second because I don't see anyone with a question right now. But my question or comment at the moment is that we've started out with a topic that's all about suffering. And I picture the topic, because you can interpret it however you want, but I picture it being that, we're in suffering and we have our own personal suffering, and that leads to the question of maybe there's something outside that can give meaning or give comfort. And what I find really interesting is that we seem to drift toward morality. The question was about suffering, and every time it seems to turn into a moral question, which I find fascinating. Like, what is the connection between that? Why do we go from suffering to morality every time? What do you make of that?
I think that if it's a question of what helps a person feel better, if a person has some hope beyond this world and believe there's a God who can actually help us, and I think that God, it's not just a belief, but God actually is able to help us, then it's fairly clear that persons who believe that will find comfort in that. But the question which we shift over to is, why does God allow so much evil and suffering? And there the problem from the atheistic standpoint is, well, why is evil and suffering an intrinsic bad? Or why is it that we should combat it when it's not simply related to me? And I think there's a human nature aspect that says, well, we have empathy and we can care for the people around us. But to go beyond that and actually come to a position to say that says people should be treated with equal dignity, that's the hard step to come from an atheist standpoint. So the comfort one, I think most atheists would say, okay, atheism doesn't provide the comfort that Christianity does.
Thank you. Does Henrik want to comment on that last question?
Well, we come to the question, do we don't have an atheist who doesn't have a hope of an afterlife? Well, death is a natural course. We don't expect anything good after death. We understand that this life is the only life we have, and to try to build our lives as good as possible before our death. That's our only. We don't need any other consolation.
Yeah,
we are satisfied, more or less satisfied with what we have here. We don't need any to see any paradise coming after our death. We don't need it. It's just purely imaginative.
And I've said there's a great deal of consolation one can get by believing that one lived one's life in the right way, in the good way, which is for the better. But that means you're living for values that somehow you're not just making up yourself.
Thank you to all of you. We're running out of time. So thank you all for coming here. And thank you especially both of you guests, Henrik and Peter, with the discussions. Just some information, if you find this very interesting and want to continue, you do have opportunity. If you go on to Haktornet, there will be some refreshments. You just follow us and you find the way. But remember, if you have your jackets and anything, you need to bring it with you, because the doors will be closed. Not only in this lecture hall, but also there. So thank you very much. Also, when you came, you might have got a paper, an evaluation for this event. We would appreciate if you filled that in and left the paper just outside the door, because that will help us make even better events like this. Thank you very much. And also, if you want to look at this again, and once again listen to the different arguments, you will have the opportunity, if you look on the video which was taken. That will be found on YouTube and also on the veritasforum.fi. So thank you for today. Please join us to Haktornet. Thank you, Peter and Henrik.
Thank you.